Section 9 of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Section 9. He had escaped, was utterly free, as happens in the downfall of habit when the mind, like an unguarded flame, bows and bends and seems to blow from its holding. I haven't felt so young for years, thought Peter, escaping, only of course for an hour or so, from being precisely what he was, and feeling like a child who runs out of doors and sees, as he runs, his old nurse waving at the wrong window. But she's extraordinarily attractive, he thought, as walking across Trafalgar Square in the direction of the Haymarket came a young woman who, as she passed Gordon's statue, seemed, Peter Walsh thought, susceptible as he was, to shed veil after veil, until she became the very woman he had always had in mind, young but stately, merry but discreet, black but enchanting. Straightening himself and stealthily fingering his pocket-knife, he started after her to follow this woman, this excitement, which seemed even with its back turned to shed on him a light which connected them, which singled him out as if the random uproar of the traffic had whispered through hollowed hands his name, not Peter, but his private name which he called himself in his own thoughts. You, she said, only you, saying it with her white gloves and her shoulders. Then the thin, long cloak which the wind stirred as she walked past Dent's shop in Cockspur Street blew out with an enveloping kindness, a mournful tenderness, as of arms that would open and take the tired. But she's not married, she's young, quite young, thought Peter. The red carnation he had seen her wear as she came across Trafalgar Square burning again in his eyes and making her lips red. But she waited at the curbstone. There was a dignity about her. She was not worldly like Clarissa, not rich like Clarissa. Was she, he wondered as she moved, respectable? Witty, with a lizard's flickering tongue, he thought. For one must invent, must allow oneself a little diversion. A cool, waiting wit, a darting wit, not noisy. She moved, she crossed. He followed her. To embarrass her was the last thing he wished. Still, if she stopped, he would say, "Come and have an ice," he would say, and she would answer, perfectly simply, "Oh, yes." But other people got between them in the street, obstructing him, blotting her out. He pursued, she changed. There was colour in her cheeks, mockery in her eyes. He was an adventurer, reckless, he thought, swift, daring indeed, landed as he was last night from India. A romantic buccaneer, careless of all these damned proprieties, yellow dressing gowns, pipes, fishing rods in the shop windows, and respectability and evening parties and spruce old men wearing white slips beneath their waistcoats. He was a buccaneer. On and on she went, across Piccadilly and up Regent Street, ahead of him. Her cloak, her gloves, her shoulders combining with the fringes and the laces and the feather boas in the windows to make the spirit of finery and whimsy which dwindled out of the shops onto the pavement, as the light of a lamp goes wavering at night over hedges in the darkness. Laughing and delightful, she had crossed Oxford Street and Great Portland Street and turned down one of the little streets, and now, the great moment was approaching, for now she slackened, opened her bag, and with one look in his direction, but not at him, one look that bade farewell, summed up the whole situation and dismissed it triumphantly, for ever, had fitted her key, opened the door, and gone. Clarissa's voice saying, remember my party," sang in his ears. The house was one of those flat red houses with hanging flower baskets of vague impropriety. It was over. Well, I've had my fun. I've had it, he thought, looking up at the swinging baskets of pale geraniums, and it was smashed to atoms. His fun, for it was half made up, as he knew very well, invented, this escapade with the girl, made up as one makes up the better part of life, he thought, making oneself up, and making her up, creating an exquisite amusement and something more. But odd it was, and quite true, all this one could never share. It smashed to atoms. He turned, went up the street, thinking to find somewhere to sit, till it was time for Lincoln's Inn, for Messrs. Hooper and Greatley. Where should he go? No matter. Up the street, then, towards Regent's Park. His boots on the pavement struck out, no matter, for it was early, still very early. It was a splendid morning, too. Like the pulse of a perfect heart, life struck straight through the streets. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. Sweeping and swerving accurately, punctually, noiselessly, there, precisely at the right instant, the motor car stopped at the door. The girl, silk-stockinged, feathered, evanescent, but not to him particularly attractive, for he had had his fling, alighted. Admirable butlers, tawny chow-dogs, halls laid in black and white lozenges with white blinds blowing, Peter saw through the opened door and approved of. A splendid achievement in its own way, after all, London, the season, civilization, coming as he did from a respectable Anglo-Indian family which for at least 3 generations had administered the affairs of a continent. It's strange, he thought, what a sentiment I have about that, disliking India and empire and army as he did. There were moments when civilization, even of this sort, seemed dear to him as a personal possession. Moments of pride in England, in butlers, chow-dogs, girls in their security. Ridiculous enough, still there it is, he thought. And the doctors and men of business, and capable women all going about their business, punctual, alert, robust, seemed to him wholly admirable, good fellows, to whom one would entrust one's life, companions in the art of living who would see one through. What with one thing and another, the show was really very tolerable, and he would sit down in the shade and smoke. There was Regent's Park, yes. As a child he had walked in Regent's Park. Odd, he thought, how the thought of childhood keeps coming back to me, the result of seeing Clarissa, perhaps, for women live much more in the past than we do, he thought. They attach themselves to places, and their fathers. A woman's always proud of her father. Burton was a nice place, a very nice place, but I could never get on with the old man, he thought. There was quite a scene one night, an argument about something or other, what he could not remember. Politics, presumably. Yes, he remembered Regent's Park, the long straight walk, the little house where one bought air-balls to the left, an absurd statue with an inscription somewhere or other. He looked for an empty seat. He did not want to be bothered, feeling a little drowsy as he did, by people asking him the time. An elderly grey nurse with a baby asleep in its perambulator. That was the best he could do for himself, sit down at the far end of the seat by that nurse. She's a queer-looking girl, he thought, suddenly remembering Elizabeth as she came into the room and stood by her mother. Grown big, quite grown up, not exactly pretty, handsome rather, and she can't be more than 18. Probably she doesn't get on with Clarissa. There's my Elizabeth, that sort of thing. Why not here's Elizabeth simply? Trying to make out, like most mothers, that things are what they're not. She trusts to her charm too much, he thought. She overdoes it. The rich, benignant cigar smoke eddied coolly down his throat. He puffed it out again in rings which breasted the air bravely for a moment, blue, circular. I shall try and get a word alone with Elizabeth tonight, he thought, then began to wobble into hourglass shapes and taper away. Odd shapes they take, he thought. Suddenly he closed his eyes, raised his hand with an effort, and threw away the heavy end of his cigar. A great brush swept smooth across his mind, sweeping across it moving branches, children's voices, the shuffle of feet, and people passing, and humming traffic, rising and falling traffic. Down, down he sank into the plumes and feathers of sleep, sank and was muffled over. The grey nurse resumed her knitting as Peter Walsh, on the hot seat beside her, began snoring. In her grey dress, moving her hands indefatigably yet quietly, she seemed like the champion of the rights of sleepers, like one of those spectral presences which rise in twilight in woods made of sky and branches. The solitary traveller, haunter of lanes, disturber of ferns, and devastator of great hemlock plants, looking up, suddenly sees the giant figure at the end of the ride. By conviction an atheist, perhaps, he is taken by surprise with moments of extraordinary exaltation. Nothing exists outside us except a state of mind, he thinks, a desire for solace, for relief, for something outside these miserable pygmies, these feeble, these ugly, these craven men and women. But if he can conceive of her, then in some sort she exists, he thinks, and advancing down the path with his eyes upon sky and branches, he rapidly endows them with womanhood, sees with amazement how grave they become, how majestically, as the breeze stirs them, they dispense with a dark flutter of the leaves charity, comprehension, absolution, and then, flinging themselves suddenly aloft, confound the piety of their aspect with the wild carouse. Such are the visions which proffer great cornucopias full of fruit to the solitary traveller, or murmur in his ear like sirens lolloping away on the green sea waves, or are dashed in his face like bunches of roses, or rise to the surface like pale faces, which fishermen flounder through floods to embrace. Such are the visions which ceaselessly float up, pace beside, put their faces in front of, the actual thing. often overpowering the solitary traveller and taking away from him the sense of the earth, the wish to return, and giving him for substitute a general peace, as if, so he thinks as he advances down the forest ride, all this fever of living was simplicity itself, and myriads of things merged in one thing, and this figure, made of sky and branches as it is, had risen from the troubled sea. He is elderly, past 50 now, as a shape might be sucked up out of the waves to shower down from her magnificent hands compassion, comprehension, absolution. So, he thinks, may I never go back to the lamplight, to the sitting-room, never finish my book, never knock out my pipe, never ring for Mrs. Turner to clear away. Rather let me walk straight on to this great figure, who will, with a toss of her head, mount me on her streamers and let me blow to nothingness with the rest. Such are the visions. The solitary traveller is soon beyond the wood, and there, coming to the door with shaded eyes, possibly to look for his return, with hands raised, with white apron blowing, is an elderly woman who seems, so powerful is this infirmity, to seek, over a desert, a lost son, to search for a rider destroyed, to be the figure of the mother whose sons have been killed in the battles of the world. So, as the solitary traveller advances down the village street where the women stand knitting and the men dig in the garden, the evening seems ominous, the figures still, as if some august fate, known to them, awaited without fear, were about to sweep them into complete annihilation. Indoors, among ordinary things, the cupboard, the table, the window-sill with its geraniums, suddenly the outline of the landlady, bending to remove the cloth, becomes soft with light. An adorable emblem, which only the recollection of cold human contacts forbids us to embrace. She takes the marmalade. She shuts it in the cupboard. There is nothing more tonight, sir? But to whom does the solitary traveller make reply? End of section 9. Read by Hannah Dormer, London, 11th of April, 2021.